even though I was not born in an indigenous context, I can still practice shamanism because those techniques are cross-cultural, and I can enter into a shamanic journey just from my living room, basically, by applying those techniques. And also he has given Westerners the opportunity to pursue the shamanic journey and shamanic practices, even without the use of entheogens.
Keep watching to learn more. You can now download all 9 copies of the New Thinking Aloud magazine for free, or order beautiful printed copies. Go to newthinkingaloud.org. New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, a fully accredited university offering distant learning graduate degrees that focus on mind, body, and spirit. The topics that we cover here. We are particularly excited to announce new degrees emphasizing parapsychology and the paranormal. Visit their website at cihs.edu.
Book 4 in the New Thinking Aloud dialogue series is Charles T. Tart, 70 Years of Exploring Consciousness and Parapsychology, now available on Amazon.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we'll be exploring contemporary witchcraft and shamanism. My guest is Angela Puca, who is a doctoral researcher in the Department of Religious Studies at Leeds Trinity University in the United Kingdom. She is also the host of her own YouTube channel called Angela's Symposium, in which she focuses in on academic research on esoteric subjects. This is an internet interview, and now I'll switch over to the internet video. Welcome, Angela. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Hey, Jeff. Thank you so much for having me on your fantastic YouTube channel.
You have been specializing in the academic study of esoteric subjects, which I guess has opened up recently because I recall when I was a graduate student, it was almost impossible to study contemporary occult esoteric movements, even though at a popular level where I was in school at Berkeley, they were all over the place.
Yeah, it is still quite a niche subject, although there have been quite a few studies at this point, especially when it comes to Western esotericism. So, for example, you have the works by Antoine Fèvre in France, and there is a very famous school of studies on Western esotericism at the University of Amsterdam, with Hanegraaff and Marco Pasi and von Stackeldt. So yeah, actually there are a few very key scholars, but as overall, I'd say the study of magic-related topics, Western esotericism, esoteric subjects, it's still, it needs to be develop more, I'd say. And that's why I have my YouTube channel, to raise awareness that the academic study of these topics is indeed important.
Now, obviously, you're Italian, but you've chosen to do your graduate work in the United Kingdom at the University of Leeds. Do you think the atmosphere in England is more favorable to this sort of research?
Yes, indeed it is. In Italy, I think at this point it's quite impossible to pursue this kind of research So yeah, that's why I chose to do it in the United Kingdom. Yeah, actually, it was all because of my supervisor, which is Dr. Susan Owen. Yeah, I came in contact with her, and I just really adored her work, which is on shamanism, druidry, and cultural appropriation. And yeah, and so I really wanted to pursue my PhD with her as my supervisor, and that's what I did basically.
You just used an interesting term, cultural appropriation. Could you explain how that term is used in the study of religions?
Oh, well, that's a highly debated term and topic. So you will find very different ideas on the matter. And yeah, on that topic, I highly recommend my supervisor's book, which is the Native American cultural appropriation, or the cultural appropriation of Native Americans. Yeah, it is by Susan Owen. So yeah, the term is normally used in reference to the appropriation of other people's culture. And it is something that it is also relevant in my research. It is not as relevant, but it is marginally relevant because in my doctoral research, I have studied both transcultural and indigenous forms of shamanism in Italy. So, of course, it's quite interesting because, first of all, I'm using the term indigenous in an Italian context, which is something that I explain at length in my dissertation. How come I decided to employ this specific term? And also, the transcultural form of shamanism are those that basically import other forms of shamanism from other cultures, those which are normally perceived to be indigenous cultures, and they kind of translate these practices according to, of course, the cultural context they belong to. So it is a way of importing, reinterpreting, and somehow translating foreign practices and embedding them in a new cultural context. And they are usually defined as transcultural, especially in core shamanism, for example, because they are believed to go to the essence of shamanism, so to the core principles which are transcultural or cross-cultural, and they do not need to be related to one specific cultural context, but can be applied to multiple ones.
Well, I'm under the impression, since you're have referred to North American natives and their shamanistic practices, that cultural appropriation is resented by indigenous people, that they see outsiders coming in and learning some of their practices and then going out and selling workshops and so on, and making money off of their cultural practices while they themselves are still struggling. Do you find that in other cultures, say, for example, in Italy or elsewhere?
Well, in Italy, you may find some kind of reinterpretations, or, for example, native North American practices and other indigenous practices, but they are not normally done to gain a profit from it. Yeah, I think that there have been some scholars who have argued that the key aspect of cultural appropriation is disrespect of that culture and taking advantage of it from an economic point of view. So in the Italian case, usually transcultural forms of shamanism tend really not to have that kind of approach, that kind of interest in profiting from it. Whereas, transcultural forms, which may take inspiration from indigenous practices, but they only address the core aspects, the core elements, which they don't believe belong to that specific indigenous culture, but to all cultures. In that case, yeah, I'd say there isn't really a form of cultural appropriation just because culture is not really there. It is kind of, yeah, eliminated. And it is one of the criticisms that they have encountered, because there have been other scholars who have criticized forms of transcultural shamanism, saying that they are non-cultural rather than cross-cultural. And so it is still an open debate, but yeah, because those who are in favor of them say, no, it's because we go to the essence, and the essential practices are actually, they go beyond the cultural belonging. They belong to humankind. And then you have the other party who says, no, because you cannot really have a practice, you cannot understand the practice or even pursue a specific practice unless you embed it into a specific cultural context and into a tradition. So you have these both takes on the topic, which is interesting, I'd say.
I recall when I was a younger person in Berkeley, there was a large pagan community and many different overlapping pagan communities, but I'm pretty sure everybody involved, and there were hundreds and hundreds of people, probably had a conventional middle-class Western American, in this case, upbringing and with some sort of mainstream religion, and then they chose to leave the religion in which they were raised and assume a kind of pagan lifestyle, but it was never even close to being indigenous. And I imagine that's the case over most of the world today, at least the Western world.
Yeah, I think that paganism and shamanism are two different phenomena, even though they may be related, because according to some, shamanism can fall under the umbrella of paganism, but paganism is quite different. Paganism is more a religion. Of course, that may be debated as well, because you will find pagans who say it's not a religion and other pagans who say it is a religion. So normally that depends on how much the person associates the term religion to monotheistic religions, because sometimes they feel like religion is how can I put it, like a constraining kind of label, which is a constraint. And that is, when you ask them, how come do you think that, they tend to describe to you a monotheistic religion. But yeah, there have been quite a few scholars in the past decade who have argued for the term religion to be sort of not linked as much anymore to those specific religions, but just to different religious phenomena who are not necessarily of the monotheistic kind.
Many years ago, I interviewed Michael Harner. I've even been in touch with him relatively recently. And I gather from your writing that he's actually launched practically a worldwide movement of contemporary individuals who are practicing shamanism in this transcultural mode that you've described.
Yes, Michael Harner was pretty key in the spreading of shamanism in the Western world. I'd say that he and Carlos Castaneda are the two key figures here in the popularization of shamanism in the Western world. Because while Carlos Castaneda has sort of given a model for the Westerner to associate himself or herself to, which is the model of a Westerner rational person who encounters very different and perhaps not as rationalistic as a Westerner may think practices, And there is this encounter between these two words. And somehow Castaneda has given us the opportunity to see how these two words can relate, and the person can still maintain their foothold in our Western ways of perceiving the word. So I'd say that Carlos Castaneda has given us the framework, the cultural framework and the theoretical framework for a Westerner with a specific positivistic, rationalistic mindset to enter in contact with indigenous practices, which are very outside of the box for the way we think, with the way we have been thinking after the Enlightenment. And Michael Harner has given Europe and the Western world in general, especially the United States, actually at first, and then it moved on to the rest of the other Western countries. Michael Harner and core shamanism have provided Westerners with techniques, practical techniques for them to implement and say, okay, even though I was not born in an indigenous context, I can still practice shamanism because those techniques are cross-cultural, and I can enter into a shamanic journey just from my living room, basically, by applying those techniques. And also he has given Westerners the opportunity to pursue the shamanic journey and shamanic practices, even without the use of entheogens, because he explains that you can enter an altered state of consciousness even without the use of psychotropic drugs, just by using the monotonous sound of drums and rattles. And so, yeah, I'd say that whereas in Castaneda, you do have the use of psychotropic drugs. And yeah, I'd say that Michael Harner was really practical in how he affected through his tradition of core shamanism, and how he opened the doors for Westerners to experience these kind of practices, which would have been otherwise perceived as very far from our way of doing and thinking.
In both of these cases, with Michael Harner and Carlos Castaneda, you have examples of individuals who came out of the scholarly world and essentially launched contemporary religious movements. You also point out that in the case of Wicca, Gerald Gardner, who was a scholar, founded what has become a contemporary religious movement.
Yeah, this is a concept that it is addressed in a very interesting book, apart from my paper, which is on scientism and post-truth in contemporary shamanism in Italy. There is a very interesting book on this, which is called The Scientification of Religion by von Stockhart. I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly. And it talks about how academia has affected significantly new religious movements such as paganism and shamanism, both because you have cases of scholars who have become practitioners, and in other cases you have practitioners who have drawn upon academic scholarship in order to validate their beliefs and their practices. So I'd say that, for example, Gardner was not a scholar in terms of an academic scholar, but he was using Margaret Murray to justify and validate his beliefs, to say that there was this tradition of witchcraft which had been going on since the ancient times and still existed at that point. And there was a horn god which was demonized by Christianity and all these kind of things. These were published by what at the time was an academic publication, which was The God of the Witches by Margaret Murray, which was then later disproved quite massively by other scholars, like, for example, Ronald Hutton. So now nobody in the academic world thinks that that kind of scholarship, which is quite outdated as well. So, of course, even the methodology and the access they had to information was limited. But what is relevant here is not how accurate Margaret Murray's works were, but how impactful the fact that an academic had published that specific things and those specific information was to the birth of Wicca as a religion, basically. So yeah, that is interesting. And also Carlos Castaneda was a PhD student at the UCLA in the United States, and he actually only completed his PhD. He didn't pursue the academic career afterwards, whereas Michael Harner, we may say, was more of a proper academic in that after his PhD he has published quite a lot, and also he had been teaching in universities for decades, I think. Yeah.
It seems to me that the situation is that there are many people of Western middle-class backgrounds who are seeking a different kind of spiritual path. And if they don't have direct access to a lineage that is authentic and has indigenous roots, then they seek justification or appropriation from academic sources, even if those sources turn out to be faulty.
I think that is kind of the way we work as Westerners ingrained in our culture, because I think that when we have been trained, and I mean, we live in a world where certain things do not belong to our ontological world. So certain things don't exist in our society. Magic doesn't exist. Spirits don't exist, and if they do, they are embedded in specific religious belief systems. But our lay society really does not encompass this kind of beliefs. So when you are a person who is somewhat an outsider to this kind of theoretical framework that we live in as belonging to this society, this post-enlightenment positivistic society, then you have to rationalize somehow in order for those practices which are believed by your culture to be not acceptable. You have to make them acceptable somehow. And of course, academia is the epitome of rationality for the average person. I mean, to the average person, academia is the epitome of science and rationalism. And so what better way to justify and incorporate in your theoretical understanding of reality certain practices which wouldn't otherwise be considered acceptable, if not by kind of employing this kind of way. I guess that is one of the reasons as to why people tend to kind of have in high regards what academics say, especially with shamanism and paganism and esoteric practices. I'd say that the community of practitioners tends to care very much about the academic study of these subjects. I guess because they want to kind of prove to the world and to themselves that they are not crazy just because they are doing something different from what other people do and what other people believe.
So in your own research, you have done several field trips in Italy looking at indigenous witchcraft practices that are really presumably ancient and long-standing and have sort of been an underground culture in Italy for many, many generations.
Yes, I have.
And also, I understand you found amongst these practitioners that they also looked up to you to give some sort of confirmation of what they were doing because of your academic background.
Yeah, that actually happened both with the transcultural practitioners and the indigenous, autochthonous Italian practitioners. Yeah. For example, during a field work with core shamanic practitioners, we had a very intense experience on one specific night. And the day after, I'd say that most of the practitioners, most of the attendees to that workshop came to me over breakfast or over lunch asking, so Angela, what do you think as an academic about what happened yesterday? But the way they were asking, it was a mixture of seeking my validation and kind of hinting at, you cannot really say that it was all made up. You cannot really, it was like a way of saying you were there, you saw, you experienced. So as an academic, can you deny what you saw and what you perceived? So it was like they were already convinced that what they had experienced was true. Of course, true is a very difficult term to use and to position. But yeah, it was true to them, and it was something that actually happened in their reality, in our reality. At the time, it was a shared reality. But yeah, they were already convinced of that, but they still wanted my validation. When it comes to the indigenous practitioners, actually the way I encountered them was kind of serendipitous. It was pretty by chance, I'd say, because at first my doctoral research was supposed to only look at transcultural practices, sometimes referred to as neo-shamanism. But at some point, there was an informant of mine who came to me and said, "Oh, Angela, have you heard of this person who says she's an Italian shaman, not an Italian practitioner of shamanism, but an Italian shaman, So I came in contact with her. I reached out to her, and I spent a few days at hers with her husband and children and in-laws. So it was a full immersion. And she says basically that she's the last Italian shaman of a hereditary tradition. And during the days I spent with her, she explained to me all the traits of her tradition, because of course I was there to do interviews, and I also did participant observation. So I attended rituals, even impromptu rituals that she wanted me to participate in and see. And and while she was explaining to me the traits of her tradition, it kind of rang a bell, and I thought, wait, but I have already heard of these practices. And so I asked her, but what is the difference between your tradition and this form of folk healing magic in Italy? And she said, oh, that's a very good question. And then she replied that her tradition had not been syncretized with Catholicism, whereas folk healing, folk vernacular witchcraft in Italy he's pretty syncretized with Catholicism. So that was her answer. But at the same time, it prompted me to look further into it, and then it sort of opened a world because then I realized that it is quite widespread throughout the country. And there are basically this kind of vernacular witches are everywhere. And so I put their practices, their belief system, and everything in comparison to what shamanism can be said to be, which is another very difficult identifier, because it is still quite debated. But I put it in comparison with what shamanism is said to be, and with a new way of addressing what the definition of shamanism may be. And so basically I do argue in my doctoral research that this tradition of vernacular witchcraft and vernacular healing practices in Italy are or is a form of indigenous Italian shamanism.
One of the words that you used in your paper I found interesting with regard to the transcultural or more modern approaches is that they take the more ancient traditions and the word you use is they're sanitized. That tell me what the word sanitize means in this context.
When transcultural practices, which are the ones which are imported and reinterpreted by Westerners, are put in comparison with indigenous practices, which tend to be related to indigenous people, to the shamanism of indigenous people, there are certain quite evident differences that you find. And one of these is what has been referred to in literature as sanitization or sanitizing. And sanitizing means that all the dangerous and hazardous aspects of the practice have been totally removed from transcultural shamanism. So you wouldn't have like the use of psychotropic drugs. You wouldn't have anything dangerous like being left in a cave for weeks without food and water. And this actually relates to the Italian shaman I was just talking about, because she really doesn't like transcultural shamanism. And one of the things she said was, she explained to me her initiation, which happened when she was 16, and she was left in the woods, tied to a tree, and she was left there to just to be there, and without food or water, and she had to even pee on herself and everything. And she explained that as a necessary process of dehumanization, so that she would be reborn again as a shaman. And she said, how can that same process of dehumanization and sort of transcending your previous self can occur if you imagine yourself to go into a cave instead of being left into a cave for weeks. So she felt really strongly about it. So sanitizing is kind of removing everything dangerous from the practice, which may occur in different non-Western contexts and quite rarely occur when it comes to transcultural shamanism. It's been used as a way of kind of undermining sometimes the validity of transcultural practice, which is not something that I endorse. I think that they are just different, and they run into trouble when and sometimes they want to claim that they do exactly the same thing as indigenous shamans do. So, but I wouldn't say that they are not valid practices. I just say that they are clearly different. And one of the differences is the one you mentioned.
The idea of sanitization, because I did do an interview not too long ago with a fellow named Andy Hilton, who's written a book on initiation, an academic book, and he went through one of these weekend workshops on shamanism and described having had what seemed to him to be an authentic out-of-body experience in the course of a weekend workshop. He was quite amazed by it, and he felt it was something like an authentic initiation experience that really changed his life. But I gather that in indigenous cultures, a process like that could take years. You don't necessarily do it over a single weekend.
Yeah, sometimes it does take years. Apart from the indigenous shamanism, I've also been in contact for quite some time, for several years, with a form of indigenous shamanism from South America, which is the Mapuche shamanism. And I'm very familiar with other indigenous traditions, especially with Mapuche shamanism. And these are traditions where initiations are pretty long and difficult, and sometimes life-threatening, to be honest. Sometimes shamans don't want to be shamans. They are forced into that because it's either that or death, basically. So it's not as romanticized as it has been in some cases in the Western world, because we have this idea of the shaman as this mystical figure. And this is all due to Mircea Eliade, which is an author who also popularized shamanism before Castaneda, but he was more niche, I'd say. Castaneda became really popularized shamanism because he was well read even among the average people, not just academics or scholars who were particularly interested in shamanism. But Mircea Eliade was the first one, I think, or one of the first ones who portrayed the shaman as this mystical figure who belongs to this world that predates our current world and can give us access to what is really there beyond our structures, the structures we have created as Westerners. So that is a way of romanticizing shamanism, I'd say, which is pretty common.
Earlier in our conversation, you made a distinction between paganism and shamanism, although you indicated they overlapped. As I recall from your writing, you imply that the term witchcraft is sometimes used synonymously with shamanism.
In Italy, there is a paper that I've written on the discourse analysis of the terms witch and shaman in Italy, and how people who used to refer to themselves as witch are now referring to themselves as shamans. And that is because basically witch has, especially, of course, I'm referring to the Italian term, which is strega, and it has a long history of antagonism with the Catholic Church. And it's very loaded as a term with negative connotations, even from popular culture. Whereas shaman, as I was just mentioning, is pretty seen mostly in a positive light. I mean, there are, of course, shamans who would do, harmful forms of magic, but usually people in their imagination, the imaginary of the shaman is that of a very positive person, a person which helps the community and heals people, whereas the witch is more associated to perhaps, evil magic and binding spells and dangerous things which may be considered threatening to people. So shaman is a term that people in Italy, practitioners in Italy, are using more and more. And they prefer it to witch for this reason, basically, because it is better received. I think it is it's a similar process to what happened with Wicca. Even Wicca was a form of magic which was perceived in a very harmless light. Like magic is now connecting to nature, and even the magical spells tend to be very positive, and you wouldn't harm anyone, otherwise it would come back to you 3 times fold. And all this kind of way of portraying witchcraft and magic really helped Wicca to become popular, and also helped practitioners of magic to be accepted and understood by a society which before Wicca only thought of witchcraft as something evil and and dangerous to the society and to the community. So I'd say that both have sometimes romanticizing a practice or a figure can have actually a very productive outcome for the community of practitioners, because sometimes you have to break through certain preconceptions that society has in order for you to enter what is considered to be acceptable, and then you can show all the shades that specific practice actually encompasses. So well done to Wicca and the romanticization of shamanism.
Even though you are Italian, you found that in England the environment was more favorable for the sorts of research that you're doing. I wonder if it's not because the Anglican Church in England has been more open to these things, whereas the Roman Catholic Church has a history of more hostility to various esoteric movements. So, for example, psychical research, which is a big interest of mine, has flourished in England in particular.
Yeah, that is possible. To be honest, I had a very positive experience here in England in terms of how open academia is. And it is particularly interesting because I'm teaching at a Catholic institution, which is fascinating because it's like Catholicism somehow follows me. It's something that I was born into, and somehow, I'm still somewhat connected to it. So even though I am teaching in a Catholic university, they are really open to what I do. And in the past years, I have led a course at the university, which was specifically on magic. It was on magic in religious practices and how magic is embedded and conceptualized and integrated across different religions. Although in my module, I decided to focus more on non-monotheistic religions for obvious reasons, I guess, because it's not as controversial to analyze how magic is embedded in Tantrism than it is in a Christian religion. So, because of course some may argue that there is magic there, whereas most would argue that it's not quite magic. So but they didn't really had anything to say about it, whereas in Italy I can't even begin to imagine that possibility. At the moment I guess that it is still a strongly Catholic country.
I did another interesting interview with Zofia Weaver from the Society for Psychical Research about Polish mediums and Polish spiritualism. And she pointed out it was very difficult in Poland for the spiritualists because the Catholic Church regarded spiritualism as some sort of an abominable practice. So people, even the talented psychics, were discouraged, greatly discouraged by the church.
That's interesting.
Now, let me ask you another question while I have you here. You did a fascinating paper discussing scientism and post post-truth as different modalities for approaching reality. And we've talked about the scientism in the sense that many of the people engaged in transcultural shamanism look to academic experts for confirmation of their practices. How does post-truth fit in these days? We hear an awful lot about it, especially in the era of Donald Trump in the United States.
Yes. Yeah, post-truth fits in because, post-truth is, we can kind of define it as a view of reality where how emotionally engaging something, a narrative is more important to the actual facts. So the way people understand reality in a post-truth theoretical framework is not based on factual evidence, but rather on how emotionally gripping the narrative of things is. And I think it's something which is becoming more and more common in today's world.
And in fact, I know you have a Facebook group focusing on contemporary shamanism in Italy, where various participants in that group really express post-truth narratives that they believed in strongly and found very compelling, and the community of people found compelling, even though they were not factually based.
So yeah, I have opened a Facebook group which was created specifically for my doctoral research, to gather both informants and to create a community. Of course, they are aware that I'm a researcher and that everything they post can be used anonymously for my research. And there have been numerous interactions where this kind of narrative was very clear and was evidenced by the way they were interacting. Because sometimes there were altercations. Of course, there are quite often altercations on what is shamanism, for example, what constitutes a real shaman or real shamanism. And then you can, as you may read from my paper, basically those who tend to be more convincing and those who tend to be more driven by emotion and try to create a more interesting narrative tend to sort of win the conversation. So the conversation is won by the most compelling narrative rather than what has been experienced in the actual lived reality by those who participate in the discussion, which is quite interesting.
Now, I gather the distinction also is that from the scientific perspective, people with the most credentials who are considered experts are going to have an elite position, that their opinion counts more, whereas in the post-truth world, it's really just a question of numbers. Whatever the community is willing to go along with becomes accepted as reality.
Yes, and that's why I thought it was so fascinating that there are these two theoretical strands in contemporary shamanism in Italy. Maybe they are present even outside of Italy, but of course, as my fieldwork is in Italy, I focus on that one. And yeah, it is very interesting because on one end, you have this scientific mindset where only what science says is true. And so they would really seek validation from academic experts, while on the other hand, they tend to be anti-specialism somehow and just believe what is most fascinating and most compelling rather than what actually happens. So it is a very interesting mixture, which might seem contradictory at first, and maybe it even is It's just that human beings are not straightforward. We are really complex, and sometimes we encompass things which might be considered not as not as compatible, but they are compatible to certain people and certain communities.
I thought that your analysis was fascinating and that it really applies, especially here in the United States, to culture as a whole, not just to contemporary shamanistic practitioners.
Yeah, but even what we spoke about before, about the romanticizing of shamanism, that is a form of post-truth, a way of seeing post-truth as at play as well, because if you look at what shamans do across the world, they are not really this necessarily and only these very peaceful individuals, totally harmless, and so on and so forth, but they can do all sorts of things. Even Michael Harner reports that he paid for his training with a shotgun to the shaman. So this way of deciding at some point, either, I don't know, maybe they are not aware of these kind of aspects of shamanism, but at some point they sort of decide that the shaman and shamanism is this very peaceful and romanticized practice which is harmless and will put you in contact with the spirit world and help the community with no harm whatsoever, neither to yourself or to others. And yeah, so this is, I'd say, a post-truth element in that it is a narrative which is pleasing to the person who endorses it, but it might not necessarily reflect what the actual facts on that specific subject would say.
Well, Angela Puca, this has been a very enlightening, informative discussion. I'm really happy to have had this time with you, and I'd like to encourage viewers of New Thinking Aloud to visit your YouTube channel, Angela's Symposium, where you cover the realm of esoteric culture from an academic perspective. I think there's a lot to be gained there, Angela. Thank you so much for being with me.
Thank you so much, Jeff. It was a pleasure to be here and to meet you and speak to you.
And for those of you viewing, thank you for being with us. New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, a fully accredited university offering distant learning graduate degrees that focus on mind, body, and spirit. The topics that we cover here. We are particularly excited to announce new degrees emphasizing parapsychology and the paranormal. Visit their website at CIHS.edu. You can now download all 9 copies of the New Thinking Aloud magazine for free or order beautiful printed copies. Go to newthinkingaloud.org.
Book 4 in the New Thinking Aloud dialogue series is Charles T. Tart, 70 Years of Exploring Consciousness and Parapsychology, now available on Amazon.
For early access to our videos and live stream events, sign up for our free weekly newsletter at newthinkingaloud.org.